Hello again and welcome back to another episode of Adding Game Sounds, where today we're going to be shifting away from sound effects for a little bit and we're finally going to take a look at adding some music. Now the 2D game kit comes with a couple of music tracks, but we're not going to be using them. Instead, I've created my own music and I've designed that music specifically for the fourth level of the 2D game kit. Because I want to make it interactive. I don't just want a linear piece of music that loops endlessly whilst the player plays the game. I want it to change depending on what's going on within the game. So we're going to be looking at the music I've designed, how I've designed it the way I have, the goals I've kind of set for this project, and then we're going to be basically looking at how we can implement it. Now, whilst in this video we're just going to be looking at how we design the music and the interactive event in FMOD, once we get onto implementing it, you'll actually be able to follow on. I'm going to have a link underneath this video which will take you to a page on my website where you'll be able to download the FMOD project as well as the music I've created, so that once we do start looking at implementation, you can follow along with me. If you're a music composer yourself, you could even compose your own music and then take what I'll be showing you in these lessons, such as designing the FMOD event and implementing the event, so that you can create your own interactive music. But before we do any of that, we first need to take a look at the game itself. We kind of need to learn what's going on, how the mechanics work, because that's going to influence how we create our music. And we're also going to quickly set ourselves some goals or criteria as to how we want to design this music. As you can see, I've made a quick list of some of the goals I've set for myself, and these are basically going to influence how, or they have influenced, how I've designed my music. The first one, I want to create a single piece of music that plays and loops seamlessly. So as soon as the level starts, the music plays. As the player goes through, all the transitions are nice and smooth. There's no pausing, there's no juttering in between transitions, and the music doesn't finish until the player leaves the level or changes levels. Now, to make it interactive, I want the music to change and change quite significantly whenever the player makes progress in this level. So how does the player make progress? Well, as you can see, I've marked out with green little dots. This is the level, by the way. I've marked out with green dots, basically keys or switches that the player can shoot and interact with in order to open doors and progress. There's kind of 5 or 6 main, I think there's 5 main ones I found that I thought would be good places to change the music. They're quite evenly paced or, separated from each other. And yeah, whenever you interact with one, the player is able to progress forward. So the first one is right in front of the player. They just need to shoot this little switch here to open the door. So obviously the music will be quite short for that and there won't be much going on. Then once they've made it through this little puzzle, little area here, there's another switch they'll hit, which opens another door. They'll then fall down this chute, climb up here, a little bit of a puzzle here. There's another switch here, which needs to be activated by pushing a crate. So that's going to change the music again, because they've now made progress. Then they move on through here. These, by the way, the red marks are all enemies, and I'll explain why I've marked them out in a second. Move through here. There's another switch here, which you need to push a crate down. And that activates a kind of, well, basically by pushing these crates down, they act as little platforms that the player can then come down to and jump across to make it to the end. And this final bit here is like a key which they can collect. In the whole game, it's very small, but in the whole game, you're going through each of these levels to collect keys, which let you go to the boss area. So that's why the key is at the end. It's like the final thing. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 points of progression, so there's going to be 5 main changes in the music. Finally, I want the music to change and intensify when the player is near an enemy. So as I mentioned, these red marks here, the red rectangles and red dots, are where enemies are located in this level. And whenever I feel the player is significantly close to an enemy, I'm going to change the music. I want it to ramp up and intensify to, kind of add a bit of drama and tension to the scene, I suppose. But yeah, quite simple in concept, and hopefully if we can get these to work, they will make the level really interesting. So let's quickly take a look at how, with all this in mind, how I've designed my music. So as you can see here, I've made up a quick little table to kind of explain to you how my music is going to work within FMOD and within the game. So the music's going to be broken up into sections, which will just loop seamlessly and continuously until the player makes progress. Once they make progress and hit one of those switches, the music will then transition into the next section, and that section will again loop seamlessly until progress is made, and so on and so forth. Once they collect that key at the end I mentioned, the music will then bring itself right the way back to the beginning where it will continue to loop. So for those of you who are composers and you have composed for music before, you'll know that this is a type of sequencing called horizontal sequencing. Now whilst this is going on, I've also got a layer that sits underneath the music, which is basically a replica of the original music, but it's changed and intensified somewhat for whenever the player goes near an enemy. And each section has its own kind of tense version of itself. So at any point, no matter which section we're on, we can progress to a more dramatic piece of music, which we'll be able to seamlessly transition into. And this is an example of vertical sequencing. Now, hopefully, both horizontal and vertical sequencing will become a little bit more clear to you once we get the music into FMOD and you can kind of visually see how it's able to change in between each section and each piece. But I wanted to make sure I had examples of both horizontal and vertical sequencing so we could take a look at how we implement them into the game. Now, there's no real sure way of implementing either way. They're kind of more methods of composing and arranging your music rather than how you go about implementing them. When it comes to interactive music, it's all kind of context-based. Depending on what's going on in the game will influence not only how the music's designed, but how it's going to change and evolve. But in FMOD, depending on how we use horizontal and vertical sequencing, it can kind of dictate or influence how we create our parameters, which we then need to be aware of when it comes into implementing them. So that's enough of that. Let's take a look at the music itself. So here we are in Reaper. I wanted to get this up because I quickly wanted to explain how, well, not too much how I produced and composed it, but kind of how I've arranged it in my DAW and how that's kind of influenced me rendering out the music for when I then take it into FMOD. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 main points in the level that I want to change the music at, and I've marked them in my session with these markers here. So once the player hits the first switch, we'll change from this section here to this larger section here. Then there's a second section, third, fourth, and then once they make that final piece of progression, that hit that 5th switch or collect the key at the end, the music will then go back to the sort of intro section. So because of this, I had to make sure that each section will loop seamlessly on their own, but can also transition in between each other. More specifically, they can transition in between each other at any given bar. So obviously we won't be changing the music in between a bar as soon as the player makes progress, because that will cut off the music, sound too abrupt, and it will kind of mess up the rhythm a bit as well. So what we're going to do in FMOD, which you'll see shortly on, is tell our music to change only at specific points. So whenever a player activates a switch, the music will wait until it hits the next bar and then transition over to the start of the next section. So the markers indicate how the music will change horizontally, but the tracks themselves dictate how the music would change vertically. So if I quickly close this this group bus or this master track here, you can see I've got basically 2 sections of music. One I've labeled calm and colored green, and one I've labeled tense and marked red. So let's say the music is currently on section 2 and it's playing along as it should. Well, what's going to happen, and if I come over to the mixer at the bottom here to demonstrate this, is let's say the player is nowhere near any enemies, so they will be hearing the calm music and all the tracks within the calm bus. However, if the player then gets too close to an enemy, this will, in FMOD obviously, not in Reaper, this will start to fade out, and then the tense music will start to fade in, so now the player will start to hear all the music inside these tracks instead. So again, because of this, I had to make sure that as I was composing, that these sections can basically smoothly transition in between each other at any point. So whilst we'll be switching from section to section on the beat, we'll actually be transitioning from the calm and the tense track with a fade. So this will kind of smoothly transition over time. We'll crossfade them into each other. So again, it can happen at any point. The difference is, the changing between sections, they'll have to wait for the bar to finish, whereas we can switch between these 2 tracks at any point. And this, of course, is how our music will change vertically. Now, in the same way that I had to make sure that each section of the calm track would loop seamlessly on its own, I had to make sure that the tense track would do that as well. So if the player's, I don't know, standing next to some enemies but refusing to fight them for whatever reason, the music will continue on playing until they either defeat the enemies, in which it will switch back to the calm track, or make some progress. And if that happens, the music will change to the next section, but stay on the tense track, assuming they're still near the enemies. And again, just like with the calm track, it will wait for the next bar to hit before it makes that transition. Now, let's say, for example, that a player is, I don't know, they're taking in the ambience and the beautiful artwork of our game, and they just want to soak it all in for a minute, and they don't want to move around the game. Well, obviously, they'll be listening to the music that's on, whatever section they're at. But to make it more interesting and prevent it from sounding too repetitive, some of these tracks within the calm track, I've designed so that they will kind of randomly generate in a way. Or whilst in FMOD, certain parts of it will be randomly chosen. So the main thing I did that with, let me find it, is the lead track. So let's quickly take a look at that. So whilst the game is running, the cursor is obviously going to be playing our section and loop whenever it hits the end there and start again from the beginning. And as it does that, the chords which I've played here, as you can see, this track here, they're obviously going to loop, right? Nice and linear. However, this track here, and this will look clearer in FMOD, the cursor won't be triggering each section one after the other as it looks like it's doing now. Instead, we're going to tell FMOD to randomly pick one of these 6 or 8 mini sections of the melody at any point. They're composed and designed so that they can play over any of these chords. The chords are nothing special. It's just tonic, supertonic, I think it's called, subdominant and dominant. So they're just, simple chords. But yeah, the melody can basically be played over any of those chords. So whilst, the chords will be linear, this melody will be randomly switched between each little section. So it could be playing this one, then suddenly this one here, then this one, then this one. Now, all of these rules and all these ways that the music has been designed is going to affect how the music is rendered out. Now, normally you just render one whole file of music and you'd be done. However, because we've got these 2 vertical sections, we obviously want to render them out as 2 separate parts. But then we've got each section, so each section needs to be rendered out individually so it could be looped. But then each section needs to transition from one another on any bar. So we actually need to render out each bar individually on its own. But then, as I've just explained, some of the tracks will need to be selected randomly. So instead of looping each bar of section 1, for example, we need to render each bar for the chords. So they'll each have an audio file. Then we need to render each bar for the melody, so that'll have its own audio file, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Basically, we're going to, when it comes to processing this music, we kind of need to break it up and render it into each specific bar, track, and sub-track to make sure that we can make all these transitions and it's all going to fit seamlessly. Now, as well as that, you will obviously notice that I'm using MIDI here. I didn't record any instruments, just all composed it on Massive mostly. And I added a load of effects. I've gone for kind of like a mysterious but tense and actiony sci-fi track, I guess you could call it. And they're obviously going to have long reverb tails. Well, I can't just say I'd like to render this bar here of the chords and leave it at that. I need to make sure, or I did have to make sure, that I rendered it from the beginning of the bar to the end, but gave it a bit of a tail. So if I quickly play you a few bars of the chords. Each chord has its own reverb tail. I probably should have spoken then, because you probably could have listened to the tail. But each chord has its tail that lasts maybe an extra couple of bars. Now, if I was to, like I said, if I was just to render this, we'd lose that tail. We'd be rendering the chord, but we wouldn't be rendering the tail. So that would mean that whenever we play the music in FMOD, we get these really harsh transitions where the reverb tail is being cut off. So by muting the following chords and just rendering each chord individually and giving it a long tail, we get this. So once that chord's finished playing, we can trigger the next chord and keep the original one playing and let that tail kind of bleed into the second chord. And this is very important because not only will it be able to bleed into the second chord, but it will bleed into each section. So let's say I'm playing section 1. We hear that chord, and then by the time it reaches this next bar, the player's made progress, so we need to make a switch. Well, what's going to happen is we'll make the switch, the cursor will jump to the next section, but we will still hear the tail of this original chord. Again, if we cut that tail off, or didn't include it in the first place, it would be very noticeable and sound very harsh and unnatural. So this is what each of our audio files are basically going to look at. They'll have most of its data or information at sort of in the first half of the file, and then the second half will have the tail as it sort of fades out and lets the reverb carry it away. So if you imagine our cursor moving along this file, it's told to progress, so it waits till it hits the next bar, then it transitions, but it also lets this fade out and finish so that we don't interrupt it abruptly and we get a click or a pop. What's handy about breaking up your music into each bar, half bar, 2 bars, whatever, depending on when you want to make the transitions, is that we can kind of save on space, or the amount of space we take up in the game with our files. So instead of creating one massive audio file for the whole for the whole music track, well, let's say, for example, some parts repeated itself. So we've got this section here, and as I've explained, for the most part, let me zoom back into it. For the most part, these chords kind of repeat themselves. So for the first 4 bars, we play chords 1, 2, I think 5 and 4, and then that just repeats, and it doesn't change until we get to this little mini section here. So instead of rendering out this whole section, which takes up X amount of space, we're basically rendering out these first 4, and then repeating them basically, because we don't need to render out the same thing over and over again. So instead of rendering this chunk here, we're only rendering this and kind of repeating and using it. And that, like I said, will save on space, file space in the game, which is very important when it comes to audio, because it can easily take up more room than it needs to, which we obviously need to, leave room so that more important data, assets, etc. can be used within the game. So that's one benefit of basically horizontal music, chopping it up and rendering the music in individual chunks. The final thing I want to talk about with this music is this 4th section here. Now, as I mentioned, if the player's in a section, even if they're just standing around doing nothing, the section will loop and it will loop seamlessly, right? However, this last section here, just before the player collects the key that they're after, I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting. So if we zoom out, as I've explained, we've got sections that, as the player progresses, transitions are made in between them. Well, inside the last section, you can almost think of each half a bar as its own subsection. So the same thing's going to happen. Instead of looping this whole section here, only a bar or half a bar will be looped. And then it's not until the player moves closer to the key that the music will transition onto the next half a bar or so. And then once they get closer, it transitions again. So it's almost like we've got that horizontal pattern within the horizontal pattern I showed you earlier. And so this section here, well, this first half I didn't end up using in the end. So it's basically, let's get rid of that. It's basically this section here. So as you can see, I've broken them up and split them up into, god damn it, there we go, into half bars basically. So again, I rendered that on its own, making sure I gave it a tail, then that on its own, and so on. But that's pretty much the kind of overall structure and design of the music. I thought this is very important to talk about because, well, if the music's not designed properly, it's not going to work within FMOD. And things like how you're going to render your music, how it's going to be structured, and how it's going to transition are all very important things to consider. Because that's going to influence essentially how you compose your music. But yeah, I think that's enough of that. Now let's have a look at our project in FMOD. Let's have a look at how we've taken all those concepts and applied it to our event. Now, as you should be able to see straight away, there's we can instantly recognize the track. We've got our 5 sections as I've labeled them up here. And if I scroll, in fact, I might even be able to, let's get rid of that quickly. Oh, not that. There we go. If I scroll down a bit, you can also see the tense track. Now, the reason why there's only one track for the tense music, whilst there's multiple for the calm music, is because, as I explained earlier, some bits in the calm music are going to be randomly selected. So, for example, when I was mentioning the the melody earlier, how that's going to randomly change in between each section, each mini section, we need to make sure that we're independently playing that from, say, the chords, the backing, so that we can do that. Whereas with the tense track, nothing's being randomly selected. If I play this, let's quickly zoom in. If I play, come on, there we go. So with the tense track, if I play this bar here again and again and again, it's going to sound the same again and again and again. Not that I'm going to do that, but that's what would happen. But with the calm track, if I play this bar again and again and again, it will sound different. The chord is going to remain the same, but as you can see here, there's multiple audio files set to this bar. So between these 4, these are going to be picked randomly. They're also going to be picked randomly for the drums, and there's this ambient track, which is just a load of kind of white noise kind of moving around. That's also going to be picked randomly. So I've done enough waffling. Let's actually listen to the music, shall we? Let me give you a quick demonstration of how the music sounds and also how it's going to work in the game. So starting off with the intro section before the players made any progress. So as you can hear, it's just a short section that repeats itself with a few kind of bongos and toms and stuff being randomly selected. If I quickly zoom in, you can see those multi-instruments selecting random audio files. And if I click on one, here's the list of the audio files it can pick between. Now, because there's no enemies in that mini little section I pointed out to you earlier, there's no tense music for it to transition to in this section. So the only way for the music to change is if the player makes progress by shooting the first light switch, which is going to sound like this. Now notice how I changed the music with this parameter here called progress. Basically, progress is divided up into about five parts, each number representing each section. So whenever I set this number to the next section, the cursor, like I explained earlier, is going to wait until the bar finishes, and then it will make that transition. And if I zoom into section 1, you can see this transition region here is what does that. So whilst it's a little faint, you can see these green line here's are kind of divided up each bar. So even if I switch this now to 2, the cursor won't move until it touches one of these green lines. The way you set that up is by creating the transition region, obviously. So you right click up here in this little black section here. You select transition region 2, and then you select which marker or section of your music you'd like to send it to, which you create by adding a destination marker and then putting that somewhere. Once you create your region, you stretch it out and position it like you would a loop region like this one here. Then you come down to the quantization section. You basically select at which part of your music you'd like to make those transitions. Now, as I explained earlier, mine's designed to change in between each bar, so I've set mine to 1. But if I was to set it to half, you can see more green lines have been added. So now, whenever the cursor hits half a bar, it will be able to change depending on where my progress parameter is. Now, if you listen to this enough, you should hear that the melody is basically changing each time. And again, that's because it's got its own track and it's randomly selecting between 4 or a few different audio files. The same thing's happening with the percussion and the ambient fills, as you can see here. Now, the lead track is using multi-instruments, so again, as soon as the cursor hits a bar, it's going to make it's going to randomly pick one of the files. But the ambient fills are using a scatter instrument, so these files will be basically selected at any random point, so long as the cursor is touching the instrument. So this makes it a bit more, I guess, a bit more smoother, a bit more unpredictable. Because there's no real rhythm behind the ambient fills, as you can hear, it's kind of just washing white noise. It could come in whenever, so a scatter instrument worked really well for that. Now, one thing I want to quickly show you, if I zoom in, let's quickly take a look at the chords. So the chords are under the backing track. I'm just going to quickly pause the music so I can explain this. So, as you can see, this is the length of a bar, and as I explained to you earlier, my music was broken up into bars. However, this track doesn't look like it's quite the length of a bar, does it? Well, it's actually been made asynchronous. So what asynchronous basically means is that it will play, once the cursor hits this region, the region will play independently from the cursor. That means that all the cursor has to do is touch it for it to play, and the cursor can then move on to something else, but the region itself will finish the audio file it's got to play. So if the cursor starts here at bar 5, we're going to hear the backing track play this first chord. But then once it hits 6, not only are we going to hear the second chord play, but this first chord is going to continue to play, allowing us to hear that reverb tail. So if I quickly play that for you now, you should be able to see its own, they have their own cursors once they're triggered, and you'll be able to see it continue to play. So let me quickly hit play. So there you go. You can see as the next region is selected, the previous one is allowed to fade out. And the same thing goes for when switching between sections. If we played the track, starting at bar 5, this first chord would play, but once it hits bar 6, and assuming we switch the progress parameter to 2, this chord would still play. However, we then start to hear, if I quickly zoom out, we then start to hear this chord play from the next section. And the fact that we're hearing the reverb tail from the previous section bleed over into this section creates a nice smooth transition for us. And the same thing goes for all of these multi-instruments and scatter instruments. They're all asynchronous so that they can be allowed to fade out and end at their own pace, essentially. Now, section 1 has its own alternative tense track, so the player can now get near to an enemy, essentially, during this section. So when that happens, this fret level parameter is triggered, and it's switched from 0 to 1, which is going to fade in the tense track. So if I quickly open it up, fret level, and if we quickly open up the tense track and the calm track, which I'll explain how this works in a second, you can see they've been automated so that they'll fade in between each other as this parameter changes. So let's quickly do that now and set it to 1. So you can hear that change, and now we're listening to this track as opposed to the collective of these 4 or 5 tracks. And again, each file is set to asynchronous so that the tail of the previous one can bleed into, the next one. And they're also placed on each bar so we can make a transition whenever we need to. So then if the player moves away or destroys the enemies, we'll fade back into the calm track. And that's obviously how the music vertically switches in between itself. Now, as I've mentioned previously, the calm track is split into multiple tracks, basically, so that we can randomly play the lead and the percussion and so on, independently from, say, the backing, the chords. Now, in order to create that automation I explained, I need to make sure I automate them all. And whilst I could have selected the fret level parameter and gone right-click on the volume, add automation, right-click, add automation, that's a bit of a pain, especially once you then import your audio files into FMOD and into each track, and you then decide you maybe want to adjust the levels a little bit so they're not all set to 0 dB. That becomes really awkward to set up. So what I've done, if I click on one of these tracks here, is I've created a send to a return track, which you simply create in FMOD by clicking either to the left or to the right of the fader, click add send, add to event, and then you can create a new return. I created one called A, and as you can see, this is the send here. Now this fader here, this is going to send the track straight to the master track of this event, and that's not what I want. I want it to first go to my return track, which will then go to the master track. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if I bring the level of the calm track down or not. I'm still going to be getting a signal sent to the master track, which I won't have any control over with my automation. So by creating a send before the main fader of each track, as you can see here, oh, that one's got a compressor on there. This basically creates a bus, essentially. So all of these 4 tracks, or 5 tracks rather, there's an extra track here, which I'm going to explain in a bit. These are all sent to the return track, which acts as a bus. So now I can automate the volume of all of those tracks collectively. Okay, let's now have a listen to the second section that the player can listen to once they've made a little bit more progress. So this is very similar to the previous section. There's a few less instruments in it, but we've still got the backing playing chords. We've still got the lead randomly picking its melodies. You can see here. It's actually what it's doing is switching in between tracks, normal single instruments and multi-instruments. So these instruments here are going to remain consistent, but the multi-instruments are going to pick random melodies. So this way, you've got a consistent start to each kind of bar, I guess. You've got that dun, 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 but then following that up, the second half of that melody is randomly selected. So this gives us kind of like a nice balance, I suppose, between consistency and randomness. So it's not sounding too repetitive because we're repeating the same thing over and over again, but it's not sounding so random that the melody's not really forming anything too musical. So we are grounding it in some sort of structure. Now, just like last time, we can switch this to a more tense track by changing the fret level parameter. And it switches between them seamlessly. Let's take a listen to section 3 now. And let's have a listen to the tense version of section 3. By the way, you might be noticing that the music, when changing between the tense and the calm track, it's actually doing it at different times. So when we go into the tense track, it does it quite quickly, but when we go out of it, it takes a little bit longer. And the way you can set that up is if I click on the name of my parameter, let's get that menu up here, there we go. And if you turn asymmetric on, you can actually decide how long it takes for the parameter to ascend and how long it takes to descend, which as you can see, I've set here. Now, before I show you what the transition between sections 3 and 4 sounds like, I need to explain something, basically. So if I go back into Reaper, remember how I said I broke up section 4? I forgot how to zoom, there we go. I broke up section 4 into its own kind of mini sections, if that made sense. So depending on how close the player was to their destination or their goal, it would dictate which kind of mini section the player would hear, and they'd each, as they got closer, it would intensify. Well, this is what this track here is, and this event reference instrument is here. If I double click on it, you can actually see that it takes us to another event. So what's happening here is these are basically those mini sections I mentioned, and they are basically going to be held in place until this distance to goal. Here we go. So once this parameter changes, it will then change the location of our cursor to a specific section. So if I give you a quick demonstration, when the player is really far away from their goal, they'll hear this. Then once they get a bit closer, and a little bit closer, you can hear it kind of ramp up in intensity. But if they then moves back, the intensity kind of dies down a bit. Now, I've set this up using a new feature of FMOD 2.00.05, and that is magnet regions. Now, magnet regions are really cool. You might be familiar with transition regions. They work by sending the cursor of your event from a specific place. In this case, it's in between bars 1 and 8. As you can see, I've got a couple here. Sends it from a specific place to a specific place, which in this case is to mark a queue. Magnet regions, on the other hand, will basically send the cursor from anywhere in your event, it doesn't matter if it's here, 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 doesn't matter, to a specific place. So each of these magnet regions are basically being controlled by these parameters here. So this first one, for example, when distance to goal is set to 8, no matter where the cursor is in our event, it will be told to play from the beginning of this magnet region, and it will then loop that magnet region until distance to goal changes. So once it changes to 7, this magnet region kicks in and brings the cursor from bar 1 to bar 2. Now, like I said, the good thing about this is, or the unique thing about this is, the cursor is brought to a specific place from anywhere, and this gives us a unique opportunity to basically switch in between any of these tracks from any one of them. So the player, it doesn't have to go linearly, doesn't have to move from 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. If for some reason the player was at a distance of 8, but they found a way to teleport to a distance of 3 to the goal, well then they would hear this. And let's say they'd teleported back, they'd hear this. Now, this is really, really good for us because it means we can keep up with the player no matter how fast they're moving. Let's say they're moving quite consistently from 8 to 7 to 6, but they're moving faster than our music can play. This is all broken up into half bars at 115 beats per minute. So if they're moving faster than that, we might need to change from, say, 6 to 4 to keep up with them. So then we get this. And the reason why I've set this up is it prevents the music, like I said, from tailing behind. So if the player does reach their goal quite quickly, quicklier, faster than we expected, we don't have to wait for the music to go from 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4. We can jump from 8 straight to 1. Now, because of that, that's kind of why I've had to design all this within its own event. If I go back to the main event, as we know, the cursor kind of has to stick to this section and loop in order to play the tense track, which isn't broken down into mini sections like the calm track is. So in order to allow both tracks to do their thing, that's where this reference event comes in. So whilst the cursor is on this region, and so long as it's on section 4 it will be, the music from that subsection can play, and it can play how it wants. So we can change the distance to goal parameter, from anywhere we want, and the kind of mini cursor, which you'll see in a bit, will jump between those sections whenever it needs to. But then this main cursor here will continue to play linearly. So that means no matter how close the player is to the goal, we can still change the fret level and start playing the tense track linearly, or somewhat linearly. Obviously, it's going to loop in on itself again. But yeah, it means we can make that transition and it can all work nicely. We could have made I could have made the tense track, I suppose, do the same thing where it kind of progressed, depending on distance. But if you ever come across a situation like that where you need your vertical layers to do their own thing independently, event reference tracks are kind of the way to go. So let me give you a demonstration of what that transition will sound like. Now notice how the cursor from our event reference track is staying where it is because of our parameter, but you can see the regions of the tense track playing as they should. So if we change the fret level, and then change the distance to goal level, transition made quite nice. And again, I've separated the kind of ambient fills, those kind of whooshy sounds, so that they can be played randomly, like I explained earlier, using a scatter instrument. Now finally, the last thing to do is when they collect that key is send them back to that intro section. And basically I've made a quick little transition section here. This is exactly the same as the intro section, but instead of sending the cursor from section 4 straight to the intro, we first send it to this transition and then back to the intro. The reason why is because of this section here, our event reference instrument. If the cursor leaves this section, instead of fading out, the events or the regions within this track will just be stopped instantly. And we don't want that. We want, again, the tail to fade out and, release naturally. So that's why I've stretched this section out so that it plays over the transition back to the intro. If the cursor's here, we'll hear the tail off of this section here. And then by the time this transition's finished, it can send itself back to the intro. This will have faded out by then, so we're then safe to move the cursor off of this region. This event is set up so that whilst these magnet regions will drag the cursor from anywhere on the event to them, they'll only do so if the progress parameter is set to 4, which is obviously, the section that we're on. If it's on section 3 or section 5, we don't want the cursor to be on any of the... we don't want the cursor to be on any of these magnet regions. So that's how we're able to let any one of these tails fade out. Once it hits transition back to intro, the progress will be set to 5, and therefore using these transition regions and turning these magnet regions off, the cursor within this event will be pulled over to marker Q, just looping on its own endlessly, not playing anything, allowing these to, whichever one it was on, to fade out and play its tail, whilst in the main event we can hear our little transition section. So let's finally have a listen to how that sounds. And there we go, that's the whole music. And that is everything you need to know, basically, about this music that we will be implementing into the 2D game kit. Like I said, if you're interested in following along with this, or even just learning about, how you can kind of design horizontal and vertical music, there'll be a link underneath this video where you can actually download this project. It won't have all of these sound effects event. It will just have this music event for you to mess around with. You can edit it how you want. You can do whatever you want to it with the music. But the next episode we'll be looking at, which I'm hopefully going to get out next Friday. I want to get a bit of a routine going with these videos now. We're going to be looking at how we can implement this music, play it, and we're going to start by looking at how we can set up the transition in between sections. But if there's anything else you want me to look at, anything audio-wise, anything game-wise, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, I've been Henry Scott. Thank you very much for watching.